This is your introduction to the Golding Trial as we start to engage in the questions of nurture versus nature that are going to carry us through this unit and this project. Welcome. So our trial and our unit is centering on the question of where does aggressive or violent behavior come from? And social theorists and thinkers kind of go in two different directions. On one side, you have the people who believe the nature argument. The nature argument says that aggression or violence is innate, which means inborn into people. So we are born with these impulses. And the only reason we don't act on these violent or aggressive impulses all the time is that society has trained or tamed those impulses in us. So the nature argument says it's inside all of us all the time, but society helps us control it. The nurture argument says that we don't have evil inside of us, but rather that we learn evil, that society teaches those violent behaviors to us, and that rather than being born with violence inside of us, we are actually born good, pure, or blank. So let's go into more depth now about arguments on each of those sides. The nature argument says that humans are born with evil or violent tendencies. That is, that evil or violence is innate inside of us, and that these impulses or tendencies are kept in check by various aspects of society. In this picture, we see a shaken up soda bottle, which you can think of as like the violence that is percolating inside of your soul. And society is the cap that holds all of that in. If society starts to break down and the cap starts to loosen, and if the cap loosens too much, all of that violence is going to come bursting out. So the nature argument says that we have the potential for violence inside of us, but it's usually kept in control by the forces of society. So for example, if we think about bullies, we could consider that bullies are maybe the fault of society because society hasn't done a good enough job of teaching those bullies how to control their inner violence. Okay, so let's look at some different arguments that people who believe in the nature side might use to prove their point. Okay, one group of people has to do with evolution. So these are the evolutionists. And the evolutionists believe that humans, as in the first picture, have descended from primates. And therefore, we still reflect behaviors that we have inherited from our primate ancestors. And Darwin is one of the most famous evolutionists. So think about then, if you believe in evolution, what are some instinctual behaviors that we still might be acting on? For example, you might know that apes in their societies have alpha males who are the dominant males in the group. They get to mate with more of the females and they have to fight with each other to achieve that dominance. So this idea that human males also fight with each other and try to prove their dominance over each other might be a direct result of that evolved behavior that we've evolved from chimps, who have evolved it from dogs, who perhaps evolved it from animals even before that. So evolutionists think that violence is one of those behaviors that we have developed over time for survival, and therefore it has continued into humans. So if you believe that, then you might start to think that war is a natural outgrowth of our human natures, that people are born bad, which explains why there's so much war and violence in the world. If you believe that people still act on these evolved behaviors, it might just then be human nature, an evolved behavior to want more and more territory and more power. The same way that a dog will protect its territory against other people who try to come into that territory. And so if that's just an evolved behavior that we want to protect our territory and that we always want more power to feel safe, does that mean that war is inevitable? That there's nothing we can do to prevent war because it's just a part of human nature? That's one of the dark views you might take if you're a strong evolutionist. Related to evolution is this idea of survival of the fittest. And hopefully you can see the similarity in the two images here between the monkey and the woman. The idea here is that people will fight to protect their species and their children, even if that means using violence, and that is a natural behavior. Survival of the fittest says that we are driven to survive in order to pass on our genes, and that's whether through our own survival or the survival of our children. And so we need that dominance to make sure that our genes survive. That means that we will do anything that it takes either for us to survive or that our children to survive, which means that a mother, for example, might be driven to violence to protect the life of her child, or that we ourselves might be driven to violence if it came down to committing an act of violence or being killed. Okay, so the idea of protecting yourself. And that's related to survival of the fittest. That's a nature concept. Semi-related to that is this idea of genetics. So the genetic and biological arguments posit that maybe some people are born with a gene that makes them violent. The same way that a gene can determine the color of your hair or your eyes, perhaps there's a gene that can code for the amount of aggression in your personality. Perhaps boxers who are successful have a higher degree of that aggression than other people do, and that's a part of their biology, of their genetics. It's important to remember that that genes are only a guiding blueprint for behavior. So even if you believed in the genetic or the biological argument, you wouldn't necessarily say that just because somebody has an aggressive gene, that they will always be aggressive. The same way that a breast cancer gene says that somebody is perhaps more likely to get breast cancer than somebody who doesn't, there are other factors at play. So it's a blueprint, a guide. Perhaps somebody is more predisposed to be aggressive than someone without that gene, but not necessarily sentenced to it. So the idea is we are not imprisoned within our genes, but they do perhaps guide us in a certain direction, perhaps toward more violence or less violence. Totally different is this guy. This is Sigmund Freud. And Sigmund Freud says that violent behavior stems from the psyche. He is one of the most famous psychologists ever. And he came up with the concept of the id, which proposes that all people have a primitive side that is dominated by base desires and impulses. Base desires and impulses mean our most basic survival instincts. That includes things like getting food, getting shelter, sleeping, and having sex to procreate. So all of those are base desires. And Sigmund Freud thinks that all of us have an id inside of us that is screaming at us to get those things met, to do what we want so that we can survive. Sigmund Freud's idea is that some people have more dominant, stronger ids, and those people are more likely to do aggressive things. So if your id tells you that when you are angry at someone, that you should lash out and hurt them, some people are able to control their id and be like, shut up, id, I'm not going to punch that person. Whereas other people have an id that is so strong, and it's like, punch him, punch him, punch him, and they can't resist it, and then they end up committing an act of violence. So Freud's idea is that we all have the potential for violence inside of us, but some people are less able to control their ids than other people, and that explains why some people are more violent than others. These people are from religion, and if you recognize them as Adam and Eve, you are right. Adam and Eve is the story, according to the Bible in the Old Testament, of the first humans that God created. They lived in the Garden of Eden, and God forbid them from eating the apples of the tree of knowledge. And here you see Eve reaching up to pick that apple. She's going to eat it, and God will expel her and Adam from the garden because they have disobeyed his rules. That is the first sin that any human ever created, according to the Bible. So the concept of original sin, which some Christians believe in, says that all humans who have descended from Adam and Eve, who were the first humans, also carry the stain of that original sin in them. So again, you carry evil within you because you have descended from Adam and Eve. That is a nature argument. Okay, last is the media argument on the nature side. So naturists would say that we all carry the potential for violence inside of us. However, naturists would say that people like to watch violent or TV or movies because they need a way to identify with or release their natural tendency toward violence. So it's inside all of us, and we watch movies like this so that we don't act like this. So that the media we consume becomes almost a way of loosening that cap just slightly to let some of the pressure out to actually keep the violence more controlled. That's what a naturist would say about the way media impacts us. Now we're moving over to the nurture side. This is a picture of Kylo Ren, who clearly turns bad in the newest Star Wars movie. The nurture argument says that people do not have a naturally evil or aggressive side, but rather people do bad things because something in their lives causes them to turn bad. So let's look at some arguments that people on the nurture side make. Okay, this is a picture clearly of a man who has a lot of tattoos. And if you think about him when he was born, he didn't have any of those tattoos. That is the tabula rasa theory. The tabula rasa theory says that each person is born a blank slate. This slate is filled with life's many experiences, circumstances, and encounters, which create a unique and complex individual. So the same way that this man was born blank and had no tattoos on him, and over his lifetime has accumulated all the tattoos that make him look so different, each one of us is born blank with nothing on us, and then our lives and our experiences shape us into the people that we become. And that's the tabula rasa theory that was posited by John Locke. There's a whole collection of theories that revolve around behaviorism, which is a branch of social psychology. Behaviorism says that people are trained by prior experiences to respond in specific ways to a situation, including responding with violence. This picture is of a famous experiment called Pavlov's dog. If you've ever heard of a Pavlovian response, this comes from this particular experiment. This is a dog that has been trained to salivate at the sound of a bell. So this is the way the experiment works. You'll see the dog in the picture has a red wire that's hooked up to its cheek that detects whether the dog is salivating or not. And dogs, if you have a dog, you will know this, salivate when they look at food because their bodies are getting ready for them to eat. So in this experiment, the researchers put a plate of food in front of the dog, and the sensors detected that there was saliva. And they repeated that process. They would put the food in front of the dog would produce saliva. They would put the food in front of the dog would produce saliva. But then they started to add a component where first they would ring a bell. So they would ring a bell, put the food in front of the dog, and the dog would salivate. Again, they would ring the bell, put the food in front of the dog would salivate. Ring the bell, food, salivate. And after a while, you can anticipate where this goes. You would ring the bell, and the dog would immediately start to salivate, even if there was no food in front of the dog. So the idea is that over time, this dog was trained to produce a certain behavior because of its experiences. A word that explains this really well is the idea of triggering. Right? So based on your experiences and the way that your life has gone so far, certain circumstances or experiences might trigger a response in you that maybe they don't trigger in someone else because you have trained your brain to think that way. So that might include violence. For example, if every time that you've seen the people around you get angry, they lash out and punch something, you also might be trained to lash out and punch something. If you are trained to freak out whenever you hear a certain noise or hear somebody challenge your intellect, perhaps you will react with violence when somebody challenges your intellect, which doesn't mean you're evil, but that you have been trained over time to respond in that way. And that is the nurture idea of behaviorism. The nurturist media argument is pretty straightforward. Nurturists think that what surrounds us trains us to be who we are. So clearly, a nurturist would say that too much exposure to violence in the media, such as TV or movies or video games, encourages violent or aggressive behavior. So if this kid plays a whole bunch of games that look like this, he might become pretty violent. That's what a nurturist would say. Then there are the environmental arguments. The environmental arguments say that the environment that you live in matters. So if you live in a neighborhood that is filled with violence or crime, that child is more likely to grow up to become more violent than a child who does not live in that type of a neighborhood. It's important as we think about environments that there's lots of environments that we move in. So a school or religion or parents are also part of your environment. Say a kid grew up in a neighborhood that looked like this, but had a family that looked like this. If the parents or the schools or the religion can teach that kid to be good, maybe that kid doesn't exhibit the violence that we would expect them to have picked up in their neighborhood. So again, environment includes not just the place where you live, but also the people around you and those experiences that you've had. And they can balance each other out. That's part of the environmental argument. Last is the concept of free will. And so this is basically a nurture argument. It says that people are not necessarily born evil or born good, but that people are born neutral, and that people have free will to make bad or good choices at every moment of their lives. It's up to each person, regardless of his or her background, to make the right choices. An extreme proponent of free will might say that it doesn't matter anything that has happened in your life leading up to a given moment, that you have total and complete choice over your actions at that moment. And that's a very extreme version of free will, that you have total freedom of choice at every moment. So those are some of the arguments on both sides. Again, the question is, where does violence come from? Is it nature? Is it nurture? What do you believe? Are we more good? Are we more evil? Is it a balance of both? Is aggression caused by evolution? Or is it caused by behaviorism? Or are we just blank slates? Think about where you are now and continue to revisit this question over the course of the unit. We hope you will change your mind 1,000,000 times and engage in this more deeply to understand the ideas and to understand yourself.